This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends.
So, you just started using LinkedIn Premium. Now what? Well, on your premium company page, you noticed around 7.5 times more page engagement and 5 times more page views. Well done. And now, new clients are messaging you. All because you're using LinkedIn Premium, which helps you get the business growth you want. Think big, small business. Think big. Start your free trial at linkedin.com/premium small business. That's linkedin.com/premium small business.
PMS, pregnancy, menopause. Being a woman is a lot. Ollie supports you and yours with expert solutions for every age and life stage. They just launched 2 new products exclusively at Walmart. Period Hero combats bloat, mood swings, and more during PMS. And Balance Perimeno to support hormonal balance, mood, and metabolism during perimenopause. Grab yours at ollie.com.
Ollie!
These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
My guest today is Angela Denker. She is the author of the book Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. Angela is also a pastor, a journalist, and a parent, all of which are going to be relevant to the conversation that we'll be having about her book. Angela, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
We've talked about your prior book on the show. That book is called Red State Christians, and I will say you do not choose light topics. Your prior book was about Christian nationalism. This one is about radicalization. It's in a similar vein, but in some ways even a bit more alarming because it delves into the more vulnerable periods of childhood and adolescence. And I'm going to start with a broad question for you. What was the most surprising element of the research and interviews that you did for this book, and what was the least surprising?
Yeah. Well, and thank you for noting, with both of these books, the topics kind of came to me, especially this second one. I sort of had to be persuaded into it. But I've always been someone who's like, if we're going to do something, let's do something that is really what's on people's minds. And certainly the situation for young boys and men, especially in the midst of the second Trump administration, is that. And it's interesting, too.
Yes.
I didn't know that Trump was going to be reelected when I wrote this second book. But the books kind of really do follow a pattern from his first administration with more of a Christian nationalism, sort of based on a latent God and country form of Christianity. And now into this second administration, we do see much more of a heightened awareness of gender hierarchy and violent masculinity. So I would say, I guess I'll start with the least surprising part. I think the least surprising part for me was just as I investigated further some of these leading figures who've really profited off of gender hierarchy, who've really profited off of hitching their wagons to the mega train, guys like Mark Driscoll, John Piper, J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, they were not surprising. As I delved more into who they were, as I spent time in person in some instances, it was just really deep to see the visceral sense that I had that something really evil was being awakened in the words and the messages that they were putting out there, and just the level of narcissism that was activated by these men who are on the forefront of this movement, that it's really a movement about self-aggrandizement as much as it is a movement about some sort of belief system. And that functions a little differently for each person, but it's really a horrifying picture the closer you get to it. So I would say that's the least surprising part, is just the depravity of the leading figures of this movement and how little they care about the destruction that they are wreaking throughout America. The most surprising part, I would say, is there's 2 stories that make up the final chapter of the book. And I think I was most surprised that one of the stories of masculinity in this final chapter of the book involved someone who is trans. I did not anticipate that being a part of the book, a part of masculinity, but it was just a really powerful piece of what I wanted to talk about when it comes to alternative narratives around masculinity. And this is a person who came out of very conservative Christian culture and was impacted deeply by the violent masculinity championed in that culture. And yet this person also represents just an incredible amount of grace and magnanimity for their willingness to want to continue to engage and work for healing in these very same spaces. So I think that was the most surprising for me. And yeah, I bring it up because at this point I've done a lot of interviews about the book, and people don't talk about it unless maybe, I had a more right-wing review of the book and somebody had said, well, we can't throw out the book just because it mentions a transsexual. And then yesterday I did have somebody else mention Antonio, this other story. But other than that, I really haven't talked about it. And I mention it here because I think it's important for me to talk about and be comfortable talking about.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that is a very interesting narrative to include in a book like this, because of the fact that someone who is a trans man, that is someone that chooses very, very willfully and actively to align with masculinity. Like that is the choice for them. And that is a very significant choice, given that so much of masculinity, as it's demonstrated and practiced in a lot of the spaces that you talk about in your book, the sorts of spaces that I've talked about for years in other contexts, are very negative or toxic or damaging. So, I mean, I was glad to see an example like that, because it is something that individual's story is part of a very meaningful response to these other forces that are at work.
Definitely.
One of the things that just the general nature of what your book tackles is masculinity as it's practiced in Christian spaces, in white Christian spaces, because that is very much the focus of the book. And one of the things is that, a lot of this isn't necessarily new. Books like Jesus and John Wayne, really do go into and discuss the history of these things, going all the way back to Billy Graham and Billy Sunday, and even Teddy Roosevelt and muscular Christianity and all of these things. Like, there's a very long history of this type of performative, very particular type of manhood. And then even more recently, like my parents' generation, there were things like Promise Keepers and all of these other elements. So this is definitely part of the history of white American Christianity. What's different about right now? What is significant, and like what's adding to the complexity of this issue in 2025?
Well, I was going to say power and money, but I'll have to add one more word to that, which is algorithms.
Yeah.
So this movement is very much being driven by algorithms, and it's very much being driven by holding people's attention online, and masculine accounts that are, driven towards things like the manosphere, driven towards things like muscularity, gender hierarchy, sort of very combative and almost fearful approach towards women. That is all over the internet, and it's being targeted specifically towards young boys, teenage boys, young men who are looking to understand what it means to be a man. And this is what they're being served. And the pattern that I came across over and over again, and other researchers have documented this as well, is that often what happens is boys will begin watching accounts like Andrew Tate, like other folks who are just nakedly, in the case of Tate, has been accused and been involved in sex trafficking. But many of these accounts led by men who are abusive towards women, they'll start watching these accounts and they'll think it's funny in a very immature, sort of boorish way with groups of boys, not actually taking seriously what these men are putting out there about masculinity. But what happens is, as we know, when you watch something, the algorithm doesn't know if you're watching it as a joke or you think it's funny. The algorithm just knows you're watching it. So it keeps serving this kind of content over and over and over again. And inevitably, these boys have their phone in their hand all the time. They're not always with their friends. They're not always in a good place. And inevitably what happens is when they are in a bad place, maybe they've gone through a breakup, maybe something happened at school, maybe they got cut from a team, did poorly on a test, and whatever the situation was, they're being fed directly this content at a very vulnerable time and space. And if you add in some factors of isolation, whether it's rural isolation, whether it's social isolation, family isolation, add in some of these other factors, and it creates a really toxic stew of susceptibility to radicalization, to authoritarian forms of government that has existed. The technology aspect adds in another element. And of course, that technology aspect is being backed up by some of the largest concentrations of wealth that we've ever seen in this country, with folks like Elon Musk, with folks like Peter Thiel. And we're seeing, that is something new in this new Trump administration, is the addition of the tech bros into this group. And they add on a sophisticated technological element to the power and money that has long been concentrated in right-wing Christian spaces, in more traditional spaces like the Southern Baptist Convention or publishing houses like Lifeway.
Yeah, and I actually want to build off of your last point. Because radicalization really happens both online and offline. You've already mentioned the manosphere that was so frighteningly relevant and impactful in the 2024 election. Is there even a clean dividing line between these pre-existing spheres of like Christian masculinity and things like, Mark Driscoll and Wild at Heart and all of these things that have been bubbling and been in those environments for decades now? Or are they just all like fully integrated into the right-wing media ecosystem and manosphere, into this like general miasma of like suck and just like of things that are toxic to the viewer and to the person that's receiving those messages?
Yeah, I think that what's frustrating and really sad for me is so much of this is about media. And as Donald Trump himself would not be president without the cooperation and ascent of traditional media, whether it's NBC and The Apprentice, whether it's the New York Times. Donald Trump is a creation of American media. And there's been this real inability of American media to take seriously the power of right-wing forces. And maybe it's not, maybe on one hand, it's a failure to take seriously. Maybe on the other hand, it's the fact that most media executives now are very wealthy individuals and want to align themselves with right-wing economic policy, regardless of whether that's going to bring in a traditionalist gender ethic, because they figure they're going to be able to pay for secret abortions on their own anyway, so they're not concerned about the general laws of the country. But I think that alignment, the thing, again, that's new about it is just the constancy. It used to be easier to turn off the TV. We both sort of grew up in that time where you had to wait to get online and wait for the dial-up modem to connect itself. Now it is really just constant, and people have to make an effort to unplug from it, and it's so lucrative. It's so incredibly lucrative. So I think that those are some of the new things. And then at the very same time that these forces have gotten stronger, the forces of community bonds have gotten weaker, whether it's, local churches, whether it's community organizations, whether it's, just some of the social bonds that were loosened during the pandemic. All of those things at the very same time that these forces of totalitarianism have gotten stronger, the trust and connection in our local communities have gotten weaker. Politicians have defunded funding for things like public schools, parks. And so in an atmosphere where people really don't trust one another locally, we're much more susceptible to somebody telling us, well, you can trust me and I've got all the power and I've got all the influence. So it's really created a toxic stew. And of course, as a woman, I see this affects girls and young women as well. We've got the flip side of the manosphere is the trad wife movement. And it's coming at the same ends from different directions. And the money of it all, the big money of it all is the main connective factor, I think.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the local bonds and things like that have deteriorated, and that's been another constant critique of American culture. Like going back to when we were younger, even like books like Bowling Alone. Those books were already being published in the like late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah. But now, like, I don't even know what that author would think of the state of sort of atomized, individual sort of people being isolated, and what is now generally referred to as like the loneliness epidemic and things like that, and that men are often the people that are most lonely because they don't have local friends or things like that. Was there a difference that you saw between when you made visits to rural locations versus suburban or urban locations? Or did people feel that disconnect from their local communities in all of those places?
One other through line between Red State Christians and Disciples of White Jesus is that, I think a common refrain throughout my time growing up in the church, my time as a pastor, my time as a journalist, has been this idea that the church is dying, right? And I just did say, the influence generally of local congregations has really waned. At the same time, my research and my experience in both of these books has left me unable to discount and deny the value of these little community hubs, whether it was in, a garage of a couple of pastors, both of whom were military veterans in rural Minnesota, getting kids together to talk about who Jesus is and to refute this idea that Jesus is white in one of the whitest parts of America. Or whether it was going to Charleston, South Carolina. And so I think that it's this very difficult work of understanding that, yes, these bonds have frayed, but also not thinking that. I think the mistake often as a response to this idea of loneliness and that bonds have frayed is that the government, from a progressive perspective, comes in and says, we've got to create all this from scratch. And so we're going to just top down, maybe we'll fund a few individuals, consultants from Ivy League, and we're going to create community. And I think that's been the mistake. And I think it's more important to look and see the places where community continues to exist. I spent from 2019 to 2023 as a solo pastor in a rural community, in a rural church, while still living in Minneapolis and commuting over an hour. And I saw an incredible sense of community there throughout the pandemic. I experienced that community. And, was it perfect? No. But I think that it's important to look and see where community is happening and build on those pre-existing bonds rather than trying to create it from the outside. And so I saw so many places of hope. And I think that, we have to hold those places of hope side by side with the really destructive headlines that are being put out there and the really destructive stories that we also hear all the time of both violence being put out into the world by young men and boys and also the ways that they inflict that violence on themselves.
The headlines that you mentioned, one of your chapters focuses on two narratives that are often very present in coverage of the issues related to men and boys, and they're two that are sort of opposing. They are, one, that men are the problem, and two, that the men are in trouble. And you can find and replace and put boys in there too, but because I do think that And you do talk about this through the book. It's boyhood and manhood that is seeing a lot of radicalization. But if you could talk a little bit about the way in which both of those frames, men are the problem, men are in trouble, and how that limits the way that we perceive these issues.
Yeah, and you can easily sort of make that a partisan conversation and say that, well, Democrats are most concerned that men are the problem, Republicans are most concerned that men are in trouble. It's a very simplistic, reductive way of understanding it, but it tends to hold true in some cases. And I think part of that understanding is what leads to the situation where we don't have enough conversations about masculinity that are willing to acknowledge that both of those points are true. And so I think that there is this sense of shame sometimes that people feel in progressive spaces when they want to talk about the problems facing white masculinity, because it's like, oh gosh, we're so sick of men. And they've had their turn, they've wreaked a lot of havoc. There's a factor of we can't even talk about it. But what that's done is create this vacuum of content about masculinity from a more progressive perspective. And so that there's just nothing. And so when inevitably boys and young men are looking, well, what does it mean to be a man? All they're getting is this right-wing content. It's kind of like when, maybe a grandparent wants to buy a children's Bible for their grandchild. And they go into a bookstore and the only thing the bookstore carries is like the far right-wing Christian publishers.
Yes. Yeah. ESV, which is a slanted translation, and all sorts of other stuff.
Right. So I do think that, the fact is, and this is another kind of through line from Red State Christians as well, just like so many of us have family members, especially when we're talking about a white Christian population or people who are raised in white Christian communities. So just like so many of us have people in our families and in our larger communities who voted for Trump twice, who are part of the MAGA movement, in that same way, we all can think of a story of a young man or a boy in our lives who's been impacted or drawn into radicalization. There was a strong impact, certainly on the 2024 election, of young white men voting for Trump in really, really large numbers in ways that the polls didn't predict. Of course, higher than expected white women also went for Trump. So the race part of all of this is certainly a huge part of my book as well. And when it comes to the men and boys, I just kept going back to, and I don't know if you saw this as well, when they're looking at election postmortems or even election day coverage, there was such this sense for young white men in particular. Also, they were trying to expand to Hispanic men, Black men. There was such this sense that voting for Trump was like a middle finger to the establishment. And it's like this way to mark yourself as somebody different, some kind of identity, some kind of refusal to go with the grain. And I think that acknowledging that attraction to Trump is distinct from, what we've talked about more traditionally of conservative Christian communities fostering young men. This is a sort of different perspective of how young people are being drawn into Trumpism. And much of it is coming from affluent progressive communities.
Can you elaborate on that? I'm not clear on that connection.
Yeah, I think that there was a line of thinking after the 2016 election that Trump really capitalized on, famously undereducated voters, on rural voters, and certainly that did bear out. But I think this new wave of attraction to Trumpism and the MAGA movement is coming much more from places that are more affluent, places that are, and it's not even, I'm not talking about this necessarily by numbers, but I'm talking about some of the individuals too that are going to rise to positions of power and influence within this administration. You're getting a lot of people, and a lot of young men in particular, coming from progressive families, progressive backgrounds, and rebelling against it in really profound ways. And I think that audience and people who know those young men, I hope that they also read and look at my book.
Right, right. Thank you for elaborating on that. And in that regard, that ties into some of the other themes we're talking about. Is that because we don't know what everyone's looking at on their individual screens, people could be being served. They may be surrounded by a lot of progressive messaging, progressive demonstrations of things, but still have this radicalizing effect coming through their phone or through YouTube or however their TikTok, whatever the delivery mechanism is in this particular instance. That makes me curious about what you think as a pastor, as an author, of the sort of current landscape of both belief and belonging in the United States. There was this tendency for a while to think that, oh, well, the U.S. is secularizing, that Gen Z is the least religious sort of cohort to come along. But one of the outcomes of the 2024 election is seeing, well, Gen Z is actually more conservative than people thought because of impacts of the manosphere and other things. But they're also somewhat more religious. And I'm not, your answer doesn't have to be specifically about the radicalized group. I'm curious, like, if you're seeing evidence of other sorts of movements amongst younger people, younger white men. But as someone who's a pastor and has that role, in addition to all the others that you play in life, what is your sort of read on the state of things in the United States right now?
Well, I've said for a long time that I think that there's just a deep spiritual hunger in our country, especially among younger Americans, that's often been discounted and misunderstood. And it's coming out of a wake of deep cynicism and witnessed hypocrisy of the clergy abuse crisis, both in the Catholic Church and also more recently as news has come out about the depth of the abuse crisis within evangelicalism. So I continue to believe that because people are not going to church does not mean that they're not hungry for spirituality. I think it means that our churches were not providing much in the way of an authentic spirituality for a long time. So I think that's been a phenomenon that's been in existence. You know, I think Gen Z has been probably in many ways a deeply misunderstood and a deeply patronized generation. You know, I remember leading up to the 2024 election and even in the years prior to that, so much of the kind of pop culture coverage of Gen Z was so fawning and so oh, if, we could all just be more like Gen Z, and aren't they just so amazing, and they're so woke. And I think it was inevitable that was going to crash and burn, because nobody likes being told who you are without getting a chance to really define yourself. So I think that was a real sort of mistake. You know, in America, we really venerate youth in ways that are kind of unhealthy, right? Whether it's,
Yes.
plastic
Yes.
surgery or Ozempic or filters. And I think that's one of the things that happened with Gen Z is, these young people who had come through a pandemic, who had come through, a traumatic time in this country, were sort of put on this pedestal of they're going to lead us. And instead, maybe what they really needed was to be led and to be given more instruction, or be given more of an attempt of an opportunity to follow. And instead, they kind of looked around at this wasteland of institutions. When we're talking about increased religiosity, I think we have to be so careful with words now and what we mean when we say young people are becoming more religious. What I've seen as I look at some of the new and emerging data around young people and church attendance or religion, I'm unconvinced that this surge of young men maybe coming back to the church is about they want to follow Jesus. I think some of it is along the lines with MAGA movement, with the manosphere, and they're looking for hierarchy, because a lot of the church traditions that they're seeking out are very hierarchical ones. And I'm even hearing from people within the SBC that like Southern Baptist pastors are leaving for, the Anglican Church or leaving for the Catholic Church because they want to have a hierarchy that is more established and sustained than it is within the SBC. So I think there's a real pursuit of hierarchy, and religion can definitely offer a framework of hierarchy. At the same time, as a pastor, I am encouraged. I'm always we just had Easter, and I'm impressed by how many young people are coming to our little church. And it's not because we did some big church growth campaign of like papering the neighborhood with flyers or postcards, or we did some weird hokey promotion to try to get people to come. They're just kind of showing up unsolicited, and it's been a little bit unexpected for me, but it really it does seem authentic, and it is encouraging. So I think we're almost like hesitant to even talk about that because you don't want to jinx it.
Right. Yeah. And I do think that personally, I think religiosity is, somewhat neutral, like, because it can be utilized for things that are personally and socially positive. And then it can also enable Trumpism and the growth of authoritarianism and fascism in our governance and in our general politics. Yeah. So it's certainly not always like a net good, which, to your point about us being particular about our words, I think that is also true. Yeah. Continuing along that line a little bit more of pastoring, so a number of the people that you profile in the book are pastors who are in different circumstances, and a number of them are men who are really in those pastoral roles, doing their best in their contexts. I have said before, I think local pastors are sort of put in these nearly impossible predicaments on probably a daily basis, between all of the various things that they have to address and be this figurehead and oftentimes, real authority in the life of the local church, but then that life is not straightforward or clear. Even for the people that may desire a hierarchy, like for the pastor who has to calm down someone whose blood pressure is really high because of their sermon, that's very, there's different stakes. And one of the things that is so interesting, just pulling out a couple of people, there's the pastor that you spoke to, who was the pastor at the church where Dylan Roof went. And then there was a pastor in Arizona who has a personal background as being radicalized as a skinhead, but is now trying to speak out against racism and misogyny and patriarchy and all of these things that incorporate these negative types of masculinity. What is there to say and learn? What is there to learn from the people who are doing that sort of work? And I would add you as both the author as well as a pastor to that group of people, that are trying to push back on these things while also trying to keep an uneasy peace in their congregation.
Yeah, I felt increasingly called to do work with clergy and with pastors in particular, because I do think there's been sort of this beating down, especially of small local church pastors, whether it's in rural or urban or suburban settings. Just over the years of the whole scale embrace of the church growth concepts that were just never a good fit for most congregations, but that convinced pastors that we should spend all our time acting like CEOs, and we should be mapping our finances and attendance on a spreadsheet. All of that led to such a demoralization and a distraction from the central work of pastoring. So part of what I feel like my call is to offer encouragement to people who are in these roles. And certainly for me, seeing somebody like Caleb, who's the pastor you mentioned, who came from being a skinhead, from being sort of a disciple of Mark Driscoll to now just doing so many courageous and energetic things in Phoenix, which is such a hotbed of disciples of white Jesus, of Turning Point USA. I gain a lot of inspiration from that. And I think that one of the things that these folks can do is help us to craft our alternative narratives. That was really one of my purposes of the book, was to craft alternative narratives around masculinity. I think the right wing in general, and certainly Christian fundamentalists, have been very good at crafting a very simple, straightforward narrative about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a Christian man, what it means to be in a family. They've honed these narratives in really seductive ways, and they've packaged and marketed them in ways, again, the flip side being the trad wife accounts. It all looks really beautiful and attractive, and it's all surrounded by a lot of money. So what these other stories can do and individuals can do is begin to push back against those narratives with alternative narratives that are grounded in people's own communities. So one of the things that I always do when I speak about this book is I encourage all the men who are there, because there's always men in attendance as well as women, to examine their own stories and what it means for them to be a man. How do they understand their own masculinity, and begin to share that in their circles. We've had the breakdown of multi-generational spaces in America, and I've been reading some totalitarianism novels lately and some dystopian, to kind of reorient myself. And I'm noticing that a similar trait against all these dystopias is that they really segregate people according to age, and they break down the bonds across generations. So again, these little local churches where you have elderly folks, you have babies, you have children, you have conversation across generations, I think that's a worthy tool against totalitarianism. And it's a worthy tool to help young men and boys understand masculinity through the eyes of elders. And so I think all of that trust building, narrative shaping, it doesn't sound, I don't know. I mean, I wish, some venture capitalists would say, yeah, this is a worthy, thing. We're going to throw a bunch of money at it. They don't tend to fund stuff like this. They like to fund things that are, grounded in data or charts or consultants. But I think all of that has proven we've spent a lot of money on it. We've done it in my own denomination. We spent a lot of money on that kind of stuff, and it just has not worked. So how about we look back at reinvesting in the local folks and leaders who are already doing this work and who have some established levels of trust, and really encourage them instead of telling them all the things that they're not doing and they should be doing.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and then I want to, in this last little bit, I want to do a little bit of exploration with you around an idea about alternative masculinities and things like that you mentioned. We'll be right back. And then I'm going to insert a little thing. Okay. And we're back. Excuse me. And we're back. Now, Angela, you mentioned before the break that we should really focus on alternative narratives for masculinity. I often think of this as a white guy myself, born and raised in the Midwest. I still live in the Midwest. Grew up in a pretty homogenous small town that was mostly white and had relatives in other parts of Indiana. But one of the things that I think about is that there's not necessarily what I would call like a positive example of white masculinity. And what I mean by that is it's really a consequence of our ancestors' choices, that they gave up their national and ethnic identities in order to claim this general whiteness. So for a number of people that are now white, they were previously German or Irish or British or French or whatever. And then hundreds of years ago, those people shed those identities and formed new ones, and they were generally around whiteness, which is essentially in many ways like a negative identity. You're describing yourself as not a person of color. You're describing the way in which you can build identity around that, the only ways to do that are pretty toxic. leading to things like white supremacy, racism. Like, these are the sorts of things that are the natural conclusion of that. And there are certainly people who have pushed back. Why am I blanking on the author's name in the moment? Noel Ignatieff has a collection of essays called Treason to Whiteness is Loyalty to Humanity. And those are the sorts of things that I think, as a well-meaning but imperfect and human white person, like, those are the sorts of ideals that I want to pursue. But to me, that is one of the biggest sort of difficulties, is really identifying those healthier lineages, whether they're anti-racist, whether they're egalitarian, and finding those histories for white men to build a sense of community or belonging. And it's not to say that it has to be an ethnic. I don't think it can be, like, because I just don't think that there's a way to do that. But that's why books like yours are so valuable, because it helps people like me, another white guy, try to think through what is a positive view. Like, because the types of traditional masculinity that I saw growing up, and this is a totally different thing, but I didn't necessarily relate to them, but I also didn't know where to look. So, and you talk about people like that in your book, people that don't find their place, in sports or in theater or in music, and those people that fall between the cracks. So I know this is a long preface, and thank you for indulging me in this long preface, but given your own hopes and desires for the people in your family, your children, for general society, like, what are the alternative narratives that you see that people can move towards, that people can, instead of just decrying these things, find something to affirm and to proclaim? Because as you sort of mentioned, like, I think that the sort of backlash against quote unquote woke stuff is that I'm not saying resentment and spite is a good reason to vote for or against something, but it seems to be what a lot of people have done. So with all that said, then again, thank you for indulging me. What are your thoughts around these alternative possibilities for manhood, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up some really important points and things that I've thought a lot about, with this commitment to, like, a homogenized whiteness and how destructive it's been for European Americans.
Mm-hmm.
I have, as I've gotten older, have realized, the extent to which my family's Germanness is a part of who I am, a part of who we are. And I think that there's a lot of fear for white Americans, in a way, to look back at histories, because we have become aware of the depth of violence that's been attached to European Americans. Here in Minnesota, it was violence towards indigenous peoples principally. In the South, it was principally violence towards enslaved people. It's just impossible to absolve yourself completely. And I think that's been the challenge of our generations. Previous generations could sort of ignore that and whitewash that history and pretend like it didn't happen. We have enough data and information now that we can't do that anymore. So people are clinging to another way to understand who they are as people. But I think the ironic thing is that when we we work so hard to shield white men and boys from pain. We work so hard to shield white men and boys from any acknowledgement of suffering or any acknowledgement of the ways in which that they may have inflicted problems for others. And I think it's just so ironic, for me as a woman, that we have always painted men as this stronger sex, and men But the way that we treat them as a society is with such kid gloves and with such like, well, we can't, we're going to kind of hurt their feelings. And so I think that part of the answer around these alternative narratives is allowing men and boys to experience pain or hardship and letting them express that it's hard and letting them express that it hurts and it's painful, and being okay with seeing examples of male vulnerability, not as signs of weakness, but really as signs of strength. And the really awesome thing about that is, they want to use the Bible to say that the Bible tells us men are at the top and to create this whole ridiculous supremacist pyramid around gender. But actually in the Bible, we have this example of Jesus of someone who weeps at the death of his friend. We have this example of Jesus as someone who was really close with women, and female friendships were really important to him and to his ministry. And I just think those two little things, if we can nurture male-female healthy friendships, if we can nurture this idea that it's okay for men to be empathetic and vulnerable. And even as I say this, we have to be so careful because powerful men will take advantage of this. We all know the examples of, male pastors crying crocodile tears in front of the church to absolve themselves of being accused of abuse. I think we do have to be careful with how that, male tears can be manipulative. But what I'm talking about here is not these powerful men. What I'm talking about is young boys, young men in our own lives, and people like you, of understanding, hey, this has been my story. This is how I found out what was important to me as a man, eventually as a husband, as a father. And my understanding of masculinity is not in any way inferior to this vision that has been put out as the cultural ideal. And I actually think my background in sports writing and working with male athletes, professional athletes, who many people would think like, okay, they have it made. They are the alpha male. They have achieved this physical ideal of masculinity. But what I found is that for people who inhabit that, they don't have to, most of the time, have this preening sense of self-involvement. It really, this defense of masculinity as violence, as physical dominance, comes from a deep well of insecurity of many of its leading purveyors.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. It is so brittle. It is the most brittle sort of thing imaginable, that just like and that's the way in which it's very much, in my mind, sort of a product of fundamentalism. It can't harbor change. It can't harbor anything, any nuance or bit of gray.
Right.
You're either a bro's bro, a man's man, or you're not.
Right. And so it is ultimately weak, but I think that there's been an unwillingness to really confront the reality of that. And because it's been this fear about what will happen if white men and boys have to experience the same kind of sense of their own vulnerability that all of the rest of us have. And so I think that, and again, I think that comes from a sense of, we don't want them to reveal their weakness, because their purported strength is what so much holds up the whole structure of what America understands itself to be. But I do think that if we just, and I try to do this, even with my own boys, of just pull back that impulse to say, oh, don't cry, or like, don't be, weak, don't get hurt, or like, you shouldn't be sick. There's all these ideas and tropes that we have. And if we just begin to push back on those a little bit, I think we're all going to be able to live together in a much more honest and hopefully healthy place with, empathy for everybody. That, these white men and boys do deserve empathy just as much as anyone else does.
And do you think that countervailing message, that response to things like the manosphere, is it going to need to take that same level of investment of like broadcasting this, everybody's thinking that didn't vote for Trump. They're thinking, and this is a generalization, obviously, but so I've heard and thought about Steve Bannon's flooding the zone with shit on an almost daily basis, because it's like that is the state of a lot of this discourse. It's everywhere, and is it going to be through elements of entertainment and infotainment sort of things, or is it a both and sort of thing where like we need examples in all spheres of life of this sort of thing? Like, what are your thoughts in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think I often talk about like a two-pronged approach where we have this one approach on a very local grassroots level of rebuilding community, rebuilding trust, creating places for empathy, for vulnerability. All of that, I think, is very grassroots, and it sort of has to be person to person. There is some work being done in online spaces about different messages about masculinity that I think is also really important. But then I'll say on a broad level, when you're looking at like the leadership and those who are profiting the most from these movements, that answer is not like dialogue and let's just listen to them. Let's give them a chance to like explain. We've done so much of that. That is totally counterproductive because you're not going to have a good faith conversation with them. Everything that they do is strategic towards increasing their own wealth and power. It's not a good faith conversation. So I think what we really need to do with those folks is expose hypocrisy, expose who's paying them, who's profiting on every single level, every choice that they make, every claim that's made about masculinity, about things like healthcare, vaccines, all of these claims, examining who's profiting, who's making money on it. And that's the work that I think journalists should be doing rather than sort of this voyeuristic journalism of, attending right-wing events and talking about how weird it is. I'm so over that. Like, I don't need to read. Yeah,
we've had a decade of that. We
don't I don't need to read another voyeuristic article about the new right. I don't care. I'm not fascinated by it because it's kind of like what we have grown up with and lived in Christianity for a long time. And instead, let's do some investigations about money, about taxes, about policy, about weapons, and, really come with a more, like, that's where we should be employing database journalism is an investigation of the very top rung. But it's not going to happen from people who are also financially in bed with them. So
that's a very good point. That's a very good point. Do you have an ideal, do you have a particular audience that, because I mean, I could definitely say like people that are in white Christian spaces need to read your book, but I also see a similar need for people who want to understand white Christian spaces to read your book, as well as just parents of any children, because if your child is not a white boy, then your child very likely goes to school with white boys. So given that this this topic touches all of the American populace, do you have a particular group that you think would best or most benefit from the work that you poured into this book?
Yeah, I really would resonate with that, of anyone who is daily involved with shaping the lives of young boys and young men. So parents, teachers, faith leaders, and really, I think particularly folks who are maybe in more progressive, more secular spaces, people in Brooklyn, people in, San Francisco, that's painting with a very broad brush. But I just think that there's this assumption that, well, if I'm not taking my family to church and if we're in a community that's not heavily conservative or not heavily Christian, that my kids aren't going to be influenced by this. And I think the reality is that because of the depth of online radicalization, they are. And these parents and teachers and coaches and faith leaders are often caught off guard by the depth of, and the reason I say this again is not because this is where the greatest numbers of young men who are radicalized are going to come from, but young men from families with a lot of wealth and influence who become radicalized have the resources to make a big impact on this movement. Stephen Miller's from Santa Monica. He went to a very progressive high school. A lot of the people who are leading this movement are coming out of affluent progressive spaces. And so I want people to understand that these ideas, they're not inherently religious or theological ideas. They're cultural ideas. And so even if you think that just because your family is not Christian, or just because you have not been shaped by conservative Christianity, that your boys and young men are not going to be shaped by a theological idea about white male supremacy, you're wrong. It's coming through the airwaves. It's coming through movies, TV shows, books, politics. And it's really essentially a cultural, historical, I call theology of glory that's long been opposed to the message of Jesus. So I really hope that people who fit into those boxes will look into these ideas and their motivating factors, because of the way that wealth is concentrated in this country and power, these families and individuals coming from affluent spaces, coming from Ivy League schools, have a disproportionate impact on the way America goes politically. And I really want them to be aware of the ways that they're being shaped by these ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, your book is a great entry into covering a very necessary topic. Again, the book is called Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. Angela, where can people find you online? Any other place that you want to plug or mention here at the end?
Yeah, come find me on Substack. That's where I've kind of created a community. I publish at least every week on theology, on religion, but also on everyday life, parenting, and certainly on media and news. So come find me over there, and would love to have you as a part of that group.
Great. Angela Denker, thank you very much for joining me.